It is 5:47 in the morning. Somewhere in America, Ohio, maybe, or Kansas, or the outskirts of Pittsburgh, an alarm clock goes off. Not a phone, not a buzzing screen, a real alarm clock. A round metal thing on the nightstand that rattles the whole bedroom when it fires. A man reaches over and silences it. He lies there for exactly 12 seconds. Then he gets up, and the day, a completely normal Tuesday in 1950 America, begins. 6 a.m., the kitchen. The kitchen is cold, not freezing, just the particular cold of a house that has been still all night. He's the first one up. That is how it works in 1950. The man gets up first. He goes to the kitchen. He starts the percolator. The coffee percolator in 1950 is not a machine you press a button on. It is a stovetop pot, aluminum or enamelware, that you fill with water and ground coffee, set on the burner, and watch. It makes a sound, a deep, rhythmic, bubbling sound that fills the kitchen and within minutes the whole downstairs of the house. The smell of that coffee, dark and real and filling every room, is the alarm clock that wakes the rest of the family. His wife is up by 6:10. She ties her apron before she does anything else. That is not a detail. That is the signal that the day has officially begun for her. Breakfast in 1950 is not optional. It is not a protein shake grabbed on the way out the door. It is a full meal prepared from scratch every single morning. Eggs, scrambled, fried, or over easy, depending on who you ask. Toast from a loaf of Wonder Bread. Orange juice squeezed from a can, the frozen concentrate kind that launched in 1946 and changed American mornings forever. Bacon on the weekdays, sausage on Fridays. The children come down one at a time, still half asleep, and take their seats at the kitchen table. They eat without being asked twice, because in 1950, you eat what is put in front of you. The radio is on. Not for music, not yet, for the morning news. The announcer's voice, measured, authoritative, male, delivers the headlines in the cadence of a man who believes that words matter and that the American public can be trusted with the truth. The news in the summer of 1950 is heavy. 2 weeks ago, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. American troops are on their way to a peninsula most people in this kitchen have never heard of. The father listens and says nothing. His wife refills the coffee cups and changes the subject to whether the garden needs watering. Some conversations happen around the breakfast table in 1950. Some do not.
The commute. He leaves the house at 7:15 exactly. Same time every day. Every day for 11 years, give or take the war. The car in the driveway is a 1948 Ford, two-tone, dark green and cream, with a hood that could double as a dining table. He bought it used for $950 18 months ago. He washed it on Saturday. It is the cleanest thing he owns. The streets of the neighborhood are quiet in the particular way that 1950s suburbs are quiet in the early morning. Houses set back from the road, lawns still wet with dew, a paper boy finishing his route on a bicycle, the occasional dog following him down the street for company. He does not take a highway. There are no highways yet, not really. The interstate highway system will not be authorized until 1956. He takes the same surface roads he has always taken. 30 minutes through quiet residential streets and the edge of downtown, past the Woolworths that won't open until 9, past the Kroger where his wife will shop this afternoon, into the parking lot of the plant where he has worked since 1941. He parks in the same spot. He nods to the same men walking in. He punches the time clock at 7:47, 3 minutes early, which is how he prefers it. The time clock is a machine that stamps the exact time on a paper card when you insert it. The sound it makes, a clean mechanical chunk, means you are here, you are accounted for, you belong to the company's time now.
8 a.m. at work. The factory floor in 1950 is loud. Not chaotic, organized and loud. The machinery runs in shifts, 6 days a week. The men know their stations the way a musician knows their instrument, automatically, without thinking, the body doing what 11 years of repetition have taught it to do. He is a machinist. He operates a lathe. If you don't know what that is, imagine a machine that shapes metal the way a potter's wheel shapes clay, spinning, cutting, precise to within 1,000th of an inch. He is good at this. He has always been good at this. The union got him a raise last year, 12 cents an hour, which brought him to $1.68 per hour. He works 40 hours a week. That is $67.20 a week, $3,494 a year. It is a solid wage in 1950. Not wealthy, not worried. The men talk during the work, not about politics, not about Korea, not about anything that would require raising their voice above the machinery. They talk about the Tigers game. They talk about whose kid is playing Little League. They talk about whether the new foreman is going to be easier or harder than the last one. At 10 o'clock, a buzzer sounds. 15-minute break. They move to the break room. A table, a coffee urn, a wall of wooden lockers with dents in them from years of use. The coffee is terrible. Nobody says so.
While he is at the lathe, she is at the house. And her day, her completely normal Tuesday, is a different kind of work entirely. By 9 a.m., the breakfast dishes are washed and dried and back in the cabinet. The children are at school, walked to the bus stop by 8:30, watched until the bus pulled away, which is not called hovering in 1950. It is just called being a mother. The house in 1950 requires active maintenance in ways that the modern mind does not fully appreciate. Monday was laundry day. She did 3 loads by hand wringer and hung them on the line. Today, Tuesday, is ironing day. She will iron for 2 hours. Shirts, pillowcases, the children's school clothes, the dish towels. Everything gets ironed in 1950. It is not a choice. It is the standard. At 10:30, she walks 4 blocks to the Kroger. She does not drive. Many wives in 1950 do not drive, or drive only occasionally. The Kroger is 4 blocks away. She brings a list and a canvas bag, and she knows exactly which checker is fastest and which produce man gives the best cuts. Ground beef, 43 cents a pound. She buys 2 pounds. Canned tomatoes, 12 cents. She buys 3. She runs into Barbara from next door at the bread aisle, and they stand there for 11 minutes talking about the new family on Elm Street and whether the wife seems friendly. This is not gossip in 1950. This is intelligence gathering. This is how a neighborhood runs. By noon, she is back home. Lunch for herself is a cheese sandwich and a glass of milk, eaten standing at the kitchen counter while she listens to her radio program. It is a soap opera. She has been following it since 1947. She knows every character the way she knows her neighbors. She does not sit down for lunch. This is not something she has thought about. 12 p.m. The town at midday. The town is alive at noon in ways that modern American downtowns often are not. The lunch counter at the Woolworths is full. Factory workers, secretaries, small business owners, a couple of women who came downtown to shop and stopped for a chicken salad sandwich and a Coca-Cola served in a glass with a straw.
A Coca-Cola at the Woolworths lunch counter in 1950 costs a nickel. The chicken salad sandwich is 35 cents. For 40 cents, you had lunch. Downtown in 1950 is where you go for everything. There is no mall, there is no Amazon. There is the hardware store, the five and dime, the shoe store, the jeweler, the fabric store, the bank, the post office, the diner, and the movie theater that shows double features on Saturdays for 25 cents. The streets are crowded with cars and pedestrians in equal measure. The cars are enormous, long, rounded, chrome-laden, in colors that the 1960s will abandon and the 1970s will forget. Aqua, coral, two-tone green. They park diagonally against the curb downtown, which makes the street feel like it belongs equally to the people walking on it. There is no parking meter anxiety. A meter costs a penny for an hour. The children come home. At 2:30, the bus stops at the corner. Two kids get off, one runs ahead, the other walks slowly in the way of children who have something on their mind. The house smells like pot roast. She started it at 1 o'clock, low and slow in the oven, and it will cook until 5:30. The smell reaches the front porch. The 10-year-old drops his school bag on the kitchen floor. She picks it up and hands it back to him without a word, and he hangs it on the hook by the door. This is a daily transaction, no words needed. Homework first, that is the rule. 30 minutes at the kitchen table, she sitting at the other end with her mending, available but not hovering. The 7-year-old has arithmetic. The 10-year-old has a book report on Abraham Lincoln due Friday, which he mentions now, Wednesday, not Friday. That is when he mentions it. And she notes her expression on her face that she is careful not to let become words. By 3:15, they are outside. Outside means the backyard, the alley, the neighboring yards, the vacant lot 2 blocks over, where a group of boys have been building something with scrap wood for 3 weeks. They will come home when they are called for dinner. She will call once, and they will come. Not because children in 1950 are more obedient, they are not, but because they are hungry, and because the smell of that pot roast carries 2 blocks on a summer afternoon. There are no screens to compete with. The outdoors wins by default every single day.
5:30 p.m., he comes home. He is home by 5:40. He walks in the same door he has walked in for 11 years. He hangs his hat on the same hook. He calls out the same thing, "I'm home," which is not a dramatic announcement. It is simply the sound of the day shifting into its next phase. Dinner is at 6 o'clock in this house, not 6:15, not sometime around then. 6 o'clock. The family eats together every night. This is not a value or a lifestyle choice in 1950. It is simply what happens. It is structure, the same structure as the time clock at the plant, the bus schedule, the ironing on Tuesday. The day is held together by its fixed points. The pot roast is on the table by 5:58. Carrots and potatoes cooked in the same pan, a plate of bread, butter, a bottle of ketchup that someone will use and someone else will think is excessive. They talk about the day. He asks the kids about school, not in the anxious way of later decades, but in the matter-of-fact way of a man checking in on something he trusts to be running correctly. The 10-year-old mentions the book report, and he says Friday is plenty of time, without knowing that it's actually due Wednesday. The radio is off during dinner. Television, if they have one, in 1950 about 9% of American homes do, is also off during dinner. The rule is not posted anywhere. It is simply known. 7 p.m., the evening. After dinner, the dishes. She washes. The 10-year-old dries. It is his job, has been for 2 years.
the way the 7-year-old will dry dishes in 2 more years. The chores do not rotate in 1950. They are assigned by age and held until the next child is ready to take over. He reads the evening paper. The paper arrives twice a day in 1950, morning and evening editions. He reads the evening edition in his chair in the living room, not lying on the couch, not in the bedroom, in the chair, his chair. The understanding that it is his chair is total and unspoken and has never been questioned. The paper is the Trib, or the Dispatch, or the Gazette, depending on the town. 4 cents, 16 pages. World news on the front, local news inside, sports in the back, comics on the last page that both children have already read, having raced to the paper when it arrived at 4 p.m. At 7:30, the television goes on, if they have one. In 1950, television is new enough to still feel like magic. The set is in the living room, a large wooden cabinet with a small screen, 12, maybe 15 inches, and a picture that sometimes rolls and has to be adjusted by turning a knob on the side, while someone else shouts, "Stop, stop, there it is," from across the room. They watch Milton Berle on Tuesday nights, or Texaco Star Theater. The whole family on the couch, the children in their pajamas already, the room lit mostly by the blue-gray glow of the screen, because someone turned off the lamp to see it better. Television in 1950 ends at 11 p.m. It does not go to static. It plays the national anthem. The American flag fills the screen. Then it goes dark. That is the end of the broadcast day.
9 p.m. The children to bed.
10:30 p.m. Lights out.
He checks the front door. Locked. He checks the back door. Locked. He turns off the kitchen light. He winds the alarm clock, the same round metal thing on the nightstand, for 5:47. Then he is asleep. And in houses across Ohio, across Kansas, across the outskirts of Pittsburgh and the suburbs of Detroit and the quiet streets of 10,000 American towns, the same clock is wound, the same light goes dark, the same Tuesday ends the same way it always ends, the way it will end again next week and the week after that, all the way through the autumn when the leaves come down, and the winter when the children are a year older, and the summer returns. The same clock, the same 5:47. A normal day in America. 1950. If this took you somewhere, if you could smell that coffee percolating or hear that alarm clock in the dark, then you already know what this channel is about. Subscribe to Back in Time. We go back every single week. And before you go, drop a comment right now. Tell me, where in the world are you watching from? It matters to me. Someone in Kentucky, someone in Arizona, someone maybe on the other side of the world who loves American history the way we do. I want to know you're out there. Back in Time.